The helicopter roared above the suburban skyline, its blades chopping the air with a violent rhythm that seemed to match the pounding hearts inside. The wind tore across the rooftop helipad, carrying with it the desperate cries of a man clutching his pregnant, disabled wife close to his chest. She was pale, trembling, and struggling to breathe, her fragile body overwhelmed by the weight of both her condition and the chaos surrounding her. Every second mattered. The medical team had insisted that she be airlifted to the hospital before complications became irreversible. But just as salvation hovered within reach, a figure stepped out of the shadows, cold, rigid, and armed. Karen. Her name had already been whispered in anger and fear across the neighborhood, but in this moment it was screamed silently through the terror in their eyes. She stood at the edge of the platform, her hair whipping wildly in the storm of rotor wash, her lips twisted into something far darker than a smile. In her trembling hands gleamed a handgun, leveled with chilling precision at the woman who could barely stand. "She's a risk to my property," Karen hissed, her voice cutting through the mechanical thunder above. The words were absurd, cruel, and yet delivered with the conviction of someone who believed them. Property, that was what mattered most to her. Not human life, not the cries of a woman who carried both a child and a burden she never asked for. The man's voice cracked with disbelief as he shouted back, begging her to lower the weapon. His arms tightened around his wife, as though his embrace alone could shield her from the bullet already loaded in Karen's resolve. The medics froze, torn between duty and survival, their eyes darting between the helicopter and the barrel of the gun. Time seemed to bend, stretching each second into eternity, amplifying the dread that clawed at everyone's chest. For the woman in the crosshairs, fear did not come as a scream. It came as stillness. She knew her body was fragile, her steps unsteady, her pregnancy a constant reminder of both hope and risk. She had faced humiliation, threats, and endless harassment from this same woman who now stood, with her finger tightening on the trigger. But never had she imagined that her greatest fight for survival would come not from her disability or the dangers of childbirth, but from a neighbor who decided she was nothing more than a hazard. The husband's pleas rose into the storm. He promised anything: silence, surrender, even exile, if only Karen would let them leave. The child inside his wife's womb was his entire future, the reason he endured every insult, every fine, every late-night confrontation that Karen had orchestrated. And now, all of it teetered on the edge of a single bullet. Karen's expression did not soften. If anything, her eyes hardened, narrowing with a twisted sense of righteousness. In her world, order was everything. Control was her crown. And here on this rooftop, she believed she was protecting what was hers. The spinning blades above seemed to echo her madness, drowning the rooftop in chaos, yet amplifying her calm cruelty. The wife's lips moved, whispering something only her husband could hear. He leaned closer, straining to catch her final plea, her final hope. And in that instant, when the world held its breath, when even the helicopter seemed to pause in the air, the metallic click of Karen's weapon shattered the silence. No one knew yet whether it would be the sound of salvation or the end of everything. The neighborhood was meant to be a sanctuary. Rows of freshly painted houses stood shoulder to shoulder, their manicured lawns trimmed to identical perfection, their driveways occupied by polished cars that reflected the pride of ownership. To anyone passing through, it was a picture of order, a community where rules kept chaos at bay and appearances mattered more than substance. But beneath the surface of its flawless exterior lived a truth far less pristine, one that revealed itself the moment someone dared to stand out. For James and his wife Emily, moving here was supposed to mark a new chapter. James, an architect with steady hands and stubborn determination, had dreamed of building a life where his family could feel safe. Emily, though disabled from a spinal condition that left her reliant on a wheelchair and careful assistance, had always carried herself with quiet strength. Her pregnancy had been both a blessing and a risk, but for the couple, it was hope embodied, proof that despite every obstacle, they could still create something beautiful. From the day they arrived, however, there had been whispers. The Homeowners Association, better known as the HOA, ran the neighborhood like a kingdom. Its members prided themselves on absolute control, policing everything from the color of shutters to the type of mailbox residents could install. But no single figure in that hierarchy was feared more than Karen. She was not just a member of the HOA. She was its enforcer, its self-proclaimed guardian, its sharpest weapon against anything she considered a violation. And to her, James and Emily's presence was the very definition of one. At first, the offenses were minor. A wheelchair ramp attached to their porch drew an angry letter citing unauthorized alterations. A patch of wildflowers Emily had planted along the sidewalk was deemed unapproved landscaping. Even the sound of their wind chimes at night, soft and melodic, was catalogued as disruptive noise. Each notice carried the same bold letterhead, the same thinly veiled threat of escalating fines. James tried to brush it off, promising Emily that they would adapt, that eventually Karen's attention would turn elsewhere. But Karen never lost interest. Her obsession only grew. Fueled by the sight of Emily wheeling herself along the sidewalks, her condition making her an unintentional symbol of defiance against the sterile uniformity Karen worshipped. Where others saw courage, Karen saw weakness. Where neighbors offered sympathetic smiles, Karen whispered complaints about safety risks and devalued property. She documented everything, photographing their home, recording when James parked too close to the curb, timing how long Emily spent unloading groceries. Her scrutiny was relentless, her presence inescapable. Still, James resisted confrontation. He told himself that if he remained patient, if he followed the rules as best he could, the storm would pass. Yet, with every new restriction, every threat of legal action, it became clear that Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She was enforcing control. And Emily, in her condition, had become her primary target. The pregnancy only made things worse. Emily's health demanded frequent doctor visits, and sometimes she required emergency care. On one such night, when James carried her down the porch steps in urgency, Karen appeared out of the shadows, clipboard in hand, demanding to know why their porch light had not been replaced with the HOA-approved fixture. James nearly lost control in that moment, his voice trembling with rage as he ordered her to move aside. But Emily, even in pain, pleaded with him to let it go. It was not in Emily's nature to fight. She believed in grace, in patience, in rising above cruelty. But Karen's cruelty was a storm that patience could not weather. The community, too, began to fracture under her reign. Some neighbors, weary of her constant surveillance, offered James quiet words of support, slipping notes of encouragement into his mailbox. Others, fearful of crossing her, turned their eyes away, unwilling to intervene. Karen thrived on that fear, manipulating it until her authority felt absolute. James started to notice the toll it was taking on Emily. She smiled less, her laughter, once the most natural sound in their home, reduced to rare moments. Nights grew heavier, her hand resting on her stomach as if to shield the child from a world already hostile. James promised her safety, swearing he would protect both her and their unborn child no matter the cost. But deep down, he feared that promise was one he might not be able to keep. Then came the incident that shattered any illusion of peace. Emily had been invited to a neighborhood gathering, a rare attempt by a sympathetic neighbor to bring people together. James wheeled her across the street, hoping the simple act of participation might ease her isolation. For a brief moment, it worked. Laughter mingled with the smell of barbecue, and Emily allowed herself to feel part of something larger than her battles. But when Karen arrived, the atmosphere froze. Her gaze swept across the gathering, landing on Emily with a venom that silenced conversations. Without hesitation, Karen approached, her voice cutting through the air with accusations. Emily's wheelchair was blocking the fire lane, her presence was a liability, her condition a disruption to the community's image. James tried to intervene, but Karen's tirade only escalated, each word sharper than the last. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, torn between decency and fear, while Emily sat quietly, her eyes glistening not with anger, but with hurt. It was in that moment that James realized this was no longer about rules or fines. This was personal. Karen saw his wife as a threat not to property values or neighborhood order, but to the very illusion of perfection she clung to. And people like Karen, when pushed, were capable of anything. The night ended in silence, the party dissolved by tension. But for James and Emily, it marked the beginning of something far darker. Because Karen had made it clear, she would not stop until she had erased them from the neighborhood entirely. And soon, circumstances would give her the perfect chance to try. The days following the neighborhood gathering carried an uneasy silence, but James knew better than to trust it. Karen was not the kind of person who retreated after a confrontation. If anything, her anger festered in quiet moments, growing sharper in the shadows. And soon enough, her next moves began to reveal themselves. It started with fines. Small slips of paper tucked under the windshield wipers of James's truck, citing improper parking or oil stains on the driveway. Letters arrived weekly, each with the HOA's letterhead but written in Karen's unmistakable tone, cold, clipped, and seething with disdain. James tried appealing to the HOA board directly, but every complaint was met with polite dismissal, as if the members were too intimidated or too complicit to challenge her authority. Then came the surveillance. James noticed it one morning while leaving for work, a small camera mounted discreetly on a pole across the street, pointed directly at their home. Later, another appeared near the community entrance, then another near the park where Emily liked to sit. Each time, Karen claimed they were for safety. But it was no coincidence that their angles captured Emily's every movement. James's protests to the HOA were again dismissed. Security was within Karen's purview, they said, and besides, wasn't it reassuring to know the neighborhood was being monitored? For Emily, the pressure was suffocating. She no longer felt comfortable wheeling herself outside without James by her side, and even then Karen's eyes seemed to follow her everywhere. Grocery runs turned into endurance trials, with Karen lurking in parking lots, snapping photographs under the guise of documenting violations. The once quiet home that James had dreamed of became a fortress under siege, every knock at the door or rustle outside the window sending their nerves into panic. The final straw came when Emily's pregnancy began to show more visibly. What should have been a season of joy only seemed to fuel Karen's fury. She muttered about safety codes and unfit conditions during HOA meetings, never naming Emily directly, but ensuring everyone knew who she meant. James overheard her one evening telling another neighbor that bringing a child into such a household was reckless and irresponsible. The cruelty reached its peak when Emily discovered graffiti on their garage door one morning. Unfit mother. Risk to the neighborhood. The words were scrawled in red paint, dripping down the panels like blood. James's fists clenched with rage as he scrubbed the words away, his knuckles bleeding from the effort. Emily wept quietly, not from the insult, but from the realization that someone, likely Karen, had crossed from harassment into open attack. That night, James resolved to fight back. He began documenting everything, every letter, every fine, every strange photograph of Karen lurking near their property. He installed cameras of his own, carefully angled to capture anyone who approached their home. But where he sought evidence, Karen found provocation. Within days, she filed a formal complaint accusing James of illegal surveillance and creating an unsafe environment. The hypocrisy was staggering, but the HOA entertained her claims, sending James yet another warning letter. The stress began to erode Emily's health. Her doctor warned that the constant anxiety was elevating her blood pressure, placing both her and the baby at risk. Nights became restless, her body trembling from the weight of both pregnancy and fear. James felt helpless, caught between his duty to protect his wife and the invisible chains of an organization that shielded Karen from consequences. Then came the emergency. It was a late evening when Emily clutched her stomach, her face pale and strained. James rushed to her side, panic flooding his chest as she whispered of sharp pains and dizziness. Without hesitation, he carried her to the car and sped toward the hospital. But as he pulled out of the driveway, red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. A police cruiser blocked his path. The officer approached, explaining that a call had come in reporting a domestic disturbance at their address. James's voice shook with urgency as he begged the officer to let him through, pointing to his wife gasping in the passenger seat. After tense moments, the officer finally relented, waving them on, but the damage was done. By the time they reached the hospital, Emily had fainted from exhaustion. James later learned who had made the call. Karen had dialed 911 that night, claiming to have heard shouting and violence from their home. It was another one of her tactics, another weapon in her endless campaign. But this time, her cruelty had nearly cost 2 lives. The doctors stabilized Emily, but their warning was clear. She could not endure many more episodes like this. The pregnancy was fragile, her body already strained, and any additional stress could prove fatal. James sat by her bedside that night, his heart breaking as he watched her sleep, the rhythmic beep of the monitor echoing the helplessness he felt. When they returned home, James confronted Karen. He stood at her door, fists clenched, demanding to know how she could justify what she had done. She didn't flinch. With a smirk, she simply reminded him that the neighborhood's safety comes first. Her eyes glinted with satisfaction, as though his rage was the victory she craved. From that moment, James knew there would be no peace, not until something drastic happened. Karen's obsession escalated further. She began attending Emily's doctor appointments under the guise of neighborhood interest, pestering the clinic with calls about code violations involving medical transport vehicles. She spread rumors that Emily's condition was contagious, that her pregnancy was a burden on community resources. Every lie was crafted to isolate them further, to paint them as outsiders in their own home. Yet through it all, James held on to hope. He believed that if they could just endure until the baby was born, they could move away, start over somewhere far from Karen's reach. He promised Emily that brighter days lay ahead, even as his own faith faltered. But Karen was already planning something far more sinister. The opportunity came weeks later when Emily suffered another severe episode. Her doctor ordered immediate airlift to a specialized hospital in the city, a helicopter transport arranged to bypass traffic and ensure her survival. For James, it was both terrifying and relieving. Terrifying because it meant Emily's condition was critical, relieving because it offered the fastest path to safety. As the helicopter descended onto the rooftop helipad, James held his wife close, whispering promises of survival. But what he didn't know was that Karen, ever watchful, had seen the preparations. To her, the sight of Emily being rushed onto the aircraft was not a cry for help, but an invasion, a disruption to the pristine order she fought so desperately to preserve. And in Karen's mind, order had to be defended at any cost. The call from the doctor had been a warning James never wanted to hear. Emily's condition was deteriorating. Her blood pressure was dangerously high, and the stress of living under constant harassment had driven her body past its limits. The baby was at risk, and so was she. The only option left was a transfer to a specialized hospital equipped to handle high-risk pregnancies like hers. The words sank into James like knives. He had promised to protect her. But despite his vigilance, despite his endless reassurances, the weight of Karen's campaign had nearly destroyed them both. He watched Emily nod weakly as the doctor explained the need for urgent evacuation, her hand resting on her stomach as if to shield their unborn child from a world too cruel to welcome it. Arrangements were made for a helicopter transport. The hospital, several miles away, could be reached by road, but traffic would waste precious minutes Emily did not have. By air, she had a chance. James agreed without hesitation. The date and time were set. It should have been a plan that guaranteed safety. But Karen had other plans. That week, her behavior shifted into something darker, more deliberate. Neighbors whispered that they had seen her pacing the cul-de-sac at odd hours, muttering to herself, her eyes burning with a restless fire. Packages arrived at her home late at night, unmarked boxes she carried inside quickly, glancing around to see if anyone was watching. James noticed her porch light flickering at strange intervals, as though signaling to someone, or perhaps something in her mind. Then came the confrontation that confirmed James's worst fears. He returned home one evening to find Karen standing on his porch, clipboard in hand as always, but this time with a look that chilled him. She didn't bother with pleasantries or fabricated violations. Instead, she leaned close and whispered, "You think you're leaving, but you're not. This neighborhood has rules, and your wife breaks them every time she exists outside that house. If you won't correct it, I will." James froze. Her words weren't just threats anymore, they were a declaration. Karen no longer wanted compliance. She wanted control, final and absolute. He tried to push her away, to threaten legal action, but she only smiled, that twisted smirk of someone who believed themselves untouchable. That night, James couldn't sleep. He sat awake, in the dark, every sound outside their window, sending him into a panic. He knew Karen was capable of cruelty, but now he feared she was capable of violence. He checked and rechecked the locks, paced the hallways, even stationed himself by the window to keep watch. Emily, sensing his unrest, tried to comfort him despite her own exhaustion. "She wants to break us, James," she whispered softly. "Don't let her." But James couldn't shake the feeling that they were already broken. The day of the helicopter transport arrived with an air of both dread and hope. Paramedics arrived to assist Emily, their voices calm but firm as they guided her onto the stretcher. James walked beside her, clutching her hand, whispering promises of survival. For once, he allowed himself to believe they were finally escaping Karen's grasp. Until he saw her. Karen stood at the end of the street, arms crossed, eyes locked on them like a predator watching prey. She didn't move, didn't shout, didn't interfere, she simply watched. James tried to ignore her, focusing instead on Emily's labored breathing, but deep down, a storm of fear churned in his gut. He knew this wasn't over. The ambulance delivered them to the hospital rooftop, where the helicopter waited with its blades idle, glinting in the sun. The paramedics worked quickly, preparing Emily for transport, while James tried to steady his nerves. The whir of machinery, the rush of medics, the cries of his wife, it all blended into a blur of urgency. For the first time in weeks, he dared to believe they might finally be safe. But fate and Karen had other designs. No one noticed how she had slipped into the hospital, bypassing security with the ease of someone who knew how to blend into the background. No one saw her as she ascended the stairwell to the rooftop, clutching a small bag close to her chest. Inside was the object of her obsession, the instrument of her warped justice. Her footsteps echoed softly against the concrete as she emerged into the blinding light, her figure cutting across the skyline like a shadow of doom. Karen had convinced herself of one thing: Emily was a threat. To the neighborhood, to order, to everything Karen had built her life upon. And threats, in her mind, had to be neutralized. As the helicopter roared to life, blades slicing through the air, James caught sight of her. At first, he thought his mind was playing tricks, that his exhaustion had conjured her ghost. But then he saw the glint of metal in her hands. His heart stopped. Karen was here, with a gun. The rooftop exploded into chaos. Paramedics shouted, ducking behind equipment as Karen raised the weapon, her face twisted in grim determination. Emily, weak and trembling, tried to lift her head, her eyes widening in horror. James positioned himself between his wife and the gun, his voice raw as he screamed at Karen to stop. But Karen didn't stop. Her words cut through the storm of rotor wash, clear and sharp. "She's a risk to my property." It was the same twisted justification she had used for every fine, every letter, every cruel attack. Only now, it had escalated to its final irreversible form. James's world slowed to a crawl. He saw the muscles in Karen's hand tighten, saw her finger graze the trigger. He felt the tremor in Emily's hand as she whispered his name, her voice barely audible over the storm above. He wanted to shield her, to protect her. But the distance between Karen and the helicopter felt insurmountable. And then, with a sound that shattered the sky, Karen pulled the trigger. The gunshot cracked like lightning through the sky, swallowed almost instantly by the thunder of the helicopter's blades. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The world seemed suspended between life and death, as though the bullet itself had frozen midair, its destination uncertain. James's body reacted before his mind could catch up. He lunged forward, wrapping his arms tighter around Emily, shielding her with every ounce of strength he possessed. He waited for the searing pain, for the impact that would tear through flesh and bone. But the first second passed, then another. His chest still rose and fell with frantic breaths. Emily still trembled in his arms. The bullet hadn't hit. It clanged against the metal railing of the rooftop, sparking harmlessly into the air. Karen cursed under her breath, her eyes narrowing, her grip tightening on the weapon. The miss didn't deter her, it fueled her. She raised the gun again. James's voice cracked with desperation. "Stop. You don't have to do this." The words were drowned out by the roar of the helicopter, but his tone carried the weight of a man with nothing left to lose. Emily's hand gripped his arm, her strength faint but her resolve unbroken. Her lips moved, whispering something only he could hear. "Don't let her win." Karen's face twisted, a mask of conviction and madness. "You brought this on yourselves," she shouted, her voice slicing through the storm. "Your wife is a danger. She's a liability to all of us. If you won't protect this neighborhood, I will." The second shot rang out. James barely had time to react. He twisted his body, forcing Emily behind him, bracing for the inevitable. The bullet grazed his shoulder, tearing fabric and flesh, the hot sting burning into his skin. He staggered but didn't fall, his body fueled by the primal need to protect the woman clinging to him. The rooftop descended into chaos. Paramedics scrambled for cover, one of them yelling into a radio for emergency backup. The helicopter pilot shouted something unintelligible, his hand hovering over the controls, unsure whether to lift off or wait. But James knew that waiting was suicide. He turned back to Karen, his vision blurring with pain, and locked eyes with her. There was no hesitation in her stance now, no flicker of doubt. She was prepared to keep firing until Emily was gone. And yet, there was something in her eyes. Not rage, not fear, something colder. Righteousness. She believed this was justice. The third shot was inevitable. But before Karen could pull the trigger again, Emily did something that stunned everyone. She pushed herself forward, using every last ounce of strength to wheel past James, positioning herself in the open. Her fragile body shook, her face pale, but her voice rang out clear, sharp, and unyielding. "If I'm such a threat," she shouted over the roar of the helicopter, "then look at me. Look at what you're trying to destroy. Is this what order means to you, Karen? Killing a mother and her child." The words cut through the storm, and for a split second, even Karen faltered. Her hand trembled, the gun lowering just slightly as Emily's defiance echoed across the rooftop. James's heart twisted with both terror and awe. His wife, broken and exhausted, had become the shield he could never be. But Karen's hesitation didn't last. Her eyes hardened once more, the barrel rising again. James saw it. He saw the finger tighten, the weapon steady. He knew he wouldn't reach her in time. The distance was too great, the wind too fierce. He had only one choice left. With a roar that ripped through his lungs, James hurled himself forward. Pain tore through his injured shoulder, but he didn't stop. He slammed into Karen, just as the fourth shot exploded from the barrel. The force knocked them both to the ground, the gun skittering across the concrete. For a moment, silence returned. The helicopter thundered above, but on the rooftop, only ragged breaths filled the air. James pinned Karen down, his hands shaking with adrenaline and fury. She writhed beneath him, spitting venom, her voice shrill. "You don't understand. I was protecting us. I was protecting everything." But James didn't hear her words. His eyes darted to Emily, who sat frozen near the stretcher, her hands pressed against her stomach, tears streaming down her cheeks. She was alive. The baby was alive. That was all that mattered. Karen thrashed beneath him, her strength surprising, her obsession fueling her resistance. But James held firm until the paramedics rushed forward, one of them grabbing the weapon while another restrained her arms. She screamed, her words fractured and meaningless, swallowed by the roar of the helicopter. Finally, sirens wailed in the distance, police rushing to the scene. Relief washed over James, though it was laced with exhaustion and pain. He staggered back to Emily's side, collapsing beside her, his blood dripping onto the rooftop as he cradled her face in his hands. "We're safe now," he whispered, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. "It's over." Emily leaned her forehead against his, her voice breaking. "Promise me it really is." The police stormed the rooftop moments later, weapons drawn, eyes wide at the scene before them. They took Karen into custody, her protests wild and incoherent. Her face contorted with the twisted satisfaction of someone who still believed she had been right. But her reign of terror was finished. The paramedics moved quickly, securing Emily onto the stretcher once more. James squeezed her hand, refusing to let go until the very last second as they loaded her onto the helicopter. This time, as the blades thundered to life, there was no Karen, no gun, no threat, only the desperate hope that they had survived long enough to see their child born. As the helicopter lifted into the sky, James stood at the edge of the rooftop, his shoulder bleeding, his body trembling. Below him, the city stretched endlessly, indifferent to the battles waged in its shadows. He closed his eyes, exhaling a breath he felt he had been holding for months. Karen's voice still echoed in his ears. "She's a risk to my property," but James knew the truth. The real risk had never been Emily. It had always been the neighbor who mistook cruelty for order, control for safety. And though their scars would linger, though the memory of that rooftop would haunt them forever, James vowed silently that Emily and their child would never live in fear again. Not while he still drew breath. The helicopter carried Emily into the sky, vanishing into the horizon with its promise of safety. James stood on the rooftop, his shoulder wrapped hastily by paramedics, his mind racing through every moment that had brought them here. The chaos had subsided, but silence was not comfort. It was heavy, weighted with the echoes of gunfire and the memory of Karen's voice. Below, officers led Karen away in handcuffs. She didn't resist. Instead, she walked with her head high, her lips moving in whispers no one else could hear. To her, this wasn't defeat, it was martyrdom. She believed she had been right, that she had fought for order, and in her delusion, she carried that conviction like a crown. Neighbors gathered at the edges of the street as the patrol car drove away, their faces pale, their whispers frantic. For the first time, they saw Karen not as the untouchable ruler of the HOA, but as the monster she had always been. James descended from a rooftop with weak legs, every step jarring his wounded shoulder. He refused medical transport, insisting he would follow Emily as soon as possible. He had survived, but the thought of her alone, strapped to machines fighting for their child's life, twisted his insides with dread. He pressed through the pain, driven by nothing but the need to be at her side. At the hospital, hours blurred into days. James sat vigil in the maternity ward, his hand wrapped around Emily's as doctors and nurses moved in and out. Her condition was fragile, her body weakened by both disability and the trauma of the attack. Yet there was strength in her still, a resilience that refused to surrender. James whispered to her constantly, promising safety, whispering names they had once chosen for the baby, painting pictures of the life they would build together once this nightmare ended. And then, at dawn on the third day, a cry pierced the air. Their child was born. The sound shattered the weight of fear that had hung over James for months. Tears blurred his vision as he cradled the tiny, fragile body in his arms, marveling at the miracle of survival. Emily, pale but smiling, reached out to touch their child, her eyes glistening with relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, joy outweighed sorrow. News of the rooftop shooting spread quickly through the neighborhood, then beyond. Headlines captured the story of the HOA enforcer gone rogue, painting Karen as the villain she had always been. Her trial revealed years of manipulation, countless complaints buried under the HOA's bureaucracy, and a history of harassment stretching back long before James and Emily arrived. Neighbors testified, some shamefully admitting their silence, others revealing how fear had kept them compliant. In court, Karen showed no remorse. She repeated the same words again and again. "I was protecting the neighborhood. She was a risk." The judge's gavel silenced her, sentencing her to a future stripped of freedom, her authority reduced to nothing more than echoes in a prison cell. For James and Emily, justice was bittersweet. The scars on James's shoulder and the shadows in Emily's eyes would never fully fade. Their home, once dreamed of as a sanctuary, now felt tainted by memories too painful to erase. But as they sat together in the quiet of their hospital room, their child resting peacefully between them, they realized survival was its own victory. In time, they made the decision to leave the neighborhood. They sold the house, packed what little joy it had held, and moved far away from the cul-de-sac where control had masqueraded as community. Their new home was smaller, humbler, but it was filled with laughter, not fear. No more fines slipped under windshield wipers, no more whispers of code violations, no more shadows lurking at the edges of their lives. James often thought back to the rooftop, to the moment Karen raised the gun and justified murder with property. That phrase haunted him, a risk to my property. It was the kind of madness that stripped humanity away, reducing life to a number on a deed. But it was also a reminder. He realized that what truly mattered could never be measured by fences, lawns, or HOA bylaws. It was measured in breath, in love, in the cry of a newborn child who had survived against all odds. Emily healed slowly, but her spirit returned. The wheelchair that Karen had mocked became a symbol of endurance, not weakness. She wore her scars openly, teaching her child that survival was not shame but strength. And James, though haunted, carried his family forward, determined never to let them be silenced by cruelty again. On quiet nights, when the wind howled outside their new home, James sometimes thought he could still hear the echo of helicopter blades, still feel the sting of blood on his shoulder, still see Karen's eyes burning with delusion. But then he would turn to Emily, to their child sleeping peacefully, and the echoes would fade. They had survived Karen, and survival was victory enough. If the story gripped you and kept you watching until the very end, then you're exactly the kind of person we created this channel for. Here on HOA Denied Access, we bring you shocking true-to-life stories of corruption, control, and the fight for freedom against abusive HOAs and the people who hide behind them. Don't let Karen win. Smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another jaw-dropping story. Your support helps us keep exposing the madness, one HOA at a time. This is HOA Denied Access, and remember, in the end, the truth always breaks through the walls they try to build around us.